Hello students. In the last two lectures, we discussed about the key tenets of classical Marxism, compared it with realism and liberalism, and also focused on some of the criticisms leveled against Marxism. Now we will discuss Neo-Marxism, which has four variants: world system theory, Gramscianism, critical theory, and Neo-Marxism. In today's lecture, we will discuss the background of Neo-Marxism and its first two variants, namely the world system theory and Gramscianism. We will proceed with the following outline. First, we will discuss about the background of Neo-Marxism. Then we will focus our attention on the main assumptions of the world system theory. Then we will discuss the key arguments of Gramscianism, and then we will end our discussion with some concluding remarks. Now let us start with the background of Neo-Marxism. Interest in Marxism was revived during the 1970s through the use of Neo-Marxist theories to explain patterns of global poverty and inequality. So these are the two main issues on the basis of which you will find several variants of Neo-Marxism, basically on the issue of global poverty and on the issue of global inequality. Neo-Marxism is not actually a theory on its own. Neo-Marxists consider themselves working within the Marxist intellectual tradition but seek to broaden or revise Marxist thought to address the topics not specifically addressed by Karl Marx. So, as I said, there are so many sub-variants of Neo-Marxism, so it's actually not a theory. Rather, it consists of so many theories or sub-theories, you can say, and basically the objective is to follow the Marxist intellectual tradition, but to broaden it and to revise the foundational principles of Marxism, keeping in view of the latest development or major changes in the world. For instance, Neo-Marxists may offer an analysis of the state, economy, or politics that move beyond the simple infrastructure, superstructure interaction. So, we have discussed the relationship between economic base and the superstructure, and how the traditional Marxists like Engels or Marx, they considered that economic base is the primary and the superstructure is the secondary thing, because the superstructure is primarily influenced by the base or the economic structure. So this kind of the relationship between infrastructure and superstructure, that is the major issue among all the variants of neoliberalism. They may combine classical Marxist analysis with forms of sociology, social psychology, or even feminism. So you will find that it's a kind of amalgamation of these kind of other alternatives, like they have borrowed from sociology, they have borrowed from social psychology, and even from feminism. So the issue is how to understand the foundational principles of Marxism in the current circumstances. That was their main concern. Also, Neo-Marxism tends to take a less rigid and more modern approach to analyzing a situation, particularly focusing on the issues of underdeveloped and co-developed country relations. So what is the relationship between the developed countries or the countries belonging to the core, and what is the relationship or kind of interaction that takes place between the peripheral countries? So that has been the main focus of these theories. Marxist higher scholars have continued to build upon the Marxist theoretical legacy up to the present day. There is much debate in Marxist circles about various elements of this legacy and some quite distinct interpretation of it. As I said, there are different types of interpretation on the foundational ideas of Marx. There is a question of debate and discussion on the issues of global poverty, global inequality, and particularly as I said, the legacies of Marx and Engels are there, but they have been interpreted, they have been reinterpreted in a different way. But differences aside, there is a general agreement that the global expansion of the modern state is inseparable from the development of global capitalism. So there are differences in all the variants of Neo-Marxism, but they are unanimous on the issue that you can't understand development of or the expansion of modern state without understanding the development of global capitalism. Neo-Marxism can be understood through the following sub-variants. First is world systems theory, the second is Gramscianism, third is critical theory, and the fourth is the new one called Neo-Marxism. So we will discuss about these sub-variants of Neo-Marxism one by one. So let us first start with the theory called world systems theory. Among the most influential contributions of the Marxist tradition to the study of world politics have been those aimed at theorizing global hierarchies of power and wealth, including theories of imperialism. So you will find basically this world system theory is based on the analysis of the global expansion of capitalism, and it is associated mainly with the global hierarchies of power and wealth, including the theory of imperialism. Although Marx himself never used the term imperialism, in the early 20th century, as there was a fear of the First World War, a generation of Marxist writers emerged who were most appropriately associated with the theory of imperialism. So, this kind of analysis starts with the beginning of the First World War. So, you will find the ideas on world system theory in the writings of Rosa Luxemburg, Nikolai Bukharin, and of course Vladimir Lenin, who argued that advanced processes of capitalist accumulation were driving the major capitalist countries into colonial expansion. So basically the argument was that because of the logic of capitalist accumulation, that you need more and more capital, you need more and more raw materials, you need more and more cheap labor, you need a market to sell your products. So these kind of capitalist accumulation were driving the major capitalist countries into colonial expansion. Although the precise mechanism driving capitalism towards imperialism varied, particularly the quest for raw materials or overproduction requiring a search for new markets, or even overaccumulation compelling the export of the capital, their thinking basically converged on the notion that advanced capitalist countries would be driven by the imperative of capitalist accumulation to support the international expansion of their great monopolies blocks of industrial financial capital. So, in a way, the basic argument is that all the advanced capitalist countries or the countries belonging to the northern part of the world, they were all interested for imperialism, for colonialism, because it was led by the logic of imperialism, because they wanted to acquire those areas, maybe for the quest of raw materials, maybe because of overproduction for which they needed new markets, or maybe overaccumulation of capital compelling the export of the same. So that may be the reason why most powerful countries of that time in Europe, maybe they are UK, maybe France, maybe Spain, maybe Portugal. So these countries were led by the capitalist class, or as we discussed in the earlier lecture, the capitalists, they use the state for their global expansion, and the state in fact protect their interest through expansion of territories, particularly through the policy of imperialism and colonialism. In a finite world where much of the globe had already been colonialized by one or the other great imperialist powers, inter-imperialist rivalry was seen as a major source of conflict, and the occurrence of First World War would have confirmed this thesis. So the argument is most of the imperial advanced countries, they were holding their colonies because they wanted more and more colonies because of their global expansion of capitalism. So that may be a major reason for inter-imperialist rivalry, and the beginning of the First World War confirmed this kind of thesis that as Lenin said, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. World system theory can be seen as a direct development of Lenin and others who work on imperialism and on the basis of Latin American dependency school. So the world system theory is a combination of what Lenin and other writers said about imperialism and global expansion of capitalism, and the dependency theory that was developed in the Latin America. In 1974, Immanuel Wallerstein developed the world systems theory to incorporate the changes of the late 20th century and counter the way traditional approaches tended to understand imperialism as a state-led process. So he combined the developments of the late 20th century with the traditional Marxist understanding of imperialism. So that basically was the objective for which he developed this world system theory. Wallerstein's approach used different units of analysis and took a much longer view of the world history of states and their interactions. He distinguished three groups of states or regions: the core, the semi-periphery and the periphery. The aim was to understand how states have developed since the 16th century in relations to each other, thereby creating relations of dependency between different groups of states. So the main objective of Wallerstein was to find out from history, starting with 16th century, that how the states interacted with each other and how that interaction, how that relations actually was based on their dependency. These relations of dependency and group required that we understand the world through broader units than the states. These units or the world systems, what he called, help to address the dilemma of why all states became capitalist, though in very unequal and different ways. So that helps us to address the hypothesis that all the states, they developed, all the advanced European countries, they developed at the same time. But why they are different in terms of their power, they are different particularly in terms of the global expansion of capitalism in a very unequal and different ways. The core group of states, what he gives the example of Western Europe and North America, refers to industrially advanced countries providing high wages and encouraging high levels of investment and welfare services. So these countries particularly, they belong to the core or the first category of states. The semi-periphery states, particularly in Latin America, they provide low wages and poor welfare services for their citizens. So you have this midpoint between the periphery and the core. There is another area what he describes as semi-periphery area. Periphery states, you can find them in sub-Saharan and Central Africa and many countries also in Asia, where workers can mostly expect wages below subsistence level and where there are no welfare services. So, the periphery is the bottom of the world systems theory, where you will find that, most of the sub-Saharan or poor countries, maybe they are in, Africa, maybe they are in Asia. So, these are the countries where workers, basically work below the minimum, wages, and where, there is no welfare scheme, there is no labor, union, there is, they are basically living under the substandard condition. The core is able to produce high profit consumption goods for itself as well as for the semi-periphery and peripheral markets, because the periphery provides the cheap labor and raw materials to the core, and the semi-periphery necessarily to make these high profit consumption goods. So there is a kind of organic relationship between the core, between the periphery and the semi-periphery, and the role of the core was to produce basically the best quality of goods and for itself, for the other two regions, that is the semi-periphery and the periphery, and the role of the periphery was to give cheap labor and raw materials to the core, and the semi-periphery necessary to make high profit consumption goods. So in a way, when there is high labor charges in the core countries, or there is high land cost in the core countries, some of the industries, some of the manufacturing services that can be located to the semi-periphery, and the main objective is to economically link the semi-periphery, the periphery with the core, and as a result, the core gets more and more rich, or it gets more and more resources, and the poor countries, they are always dependent on the core for their economic survival. In other words, although historically some states have changed their core, that is from periphery to semi-periphery, the three zones of the world economy are linked together in an exploitative relationship in which wealth is drained away from the periphery to the core, resulting in the rich getting richer and the poor becoming poorer. So this kind of economic relationship between the periphery, between the semi-periphery and between the core, this is highly unequal, because the kind of economic exchanges that takes place between these three regions is actually beneficial to the core. Maybe the semi-periphery gets some benefits, but this kind of relationship between the three regions is highly unequal, because the outcome of that economic interaction is not beneficial to the periphery at all. Rather, the periphery and the poor countries belonging to the periphery, they get poorer, and those who indulge in all kinds of economic interaction, they get richer, and the poor countries, they become poorer. So the economic exchange that takes place between the core, the semi-periphery and the periphery, it is highly unequal, because the core countries, they get all the benefit, and the periphery and the semi-periphery, if you compare these two regions, semi-periphery may be getting some benefit, but the periphery doesn't get any benefit except to sell their labor, sell their natural resources in a very low rate or in a very cheap rate to the core and to some extent to the semi-periphery. And in the process of this unequal economic exchanges, the rich becomes richer and the poor becomes poorer. Thus, relations of dependency and inequality are essential to capitalism and cannot be significantly reduced. A thinking which is one of the influences for anti-globalization and anti-capitalist movement in the world, particularly that emerged in the early 1990s. So basically the argument of Wallerstein is that this kind of dependency and inequality, it is a core part of capitalism, and it cannot be significantly reduced, because this process will continue so long as the core gets the benefit and the periphery and the semi-periphery are economically dependent on the core for their survival, for their well-being. And that is the reason why there is a lot of anti-globalization movement and anti-capitalist movement in the world, particularly in the early part of 1990s, because of these reasons that there is always a dependency relationship, and this dependency relationship is based on unequal economic exchanges between the periphery, semi-periphery and the core. Now let me discuss about another variant of Neo-Marxism, that is called Gramscianism. This strand of Neo-Marxist theory that has emerged from the work of the Italian Marxist called Antonio Gramsci, who focused on why had it proven to be so difficult to promote revolution in Western Europe, because Marx long predicted that capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction, and the more it becomes exploitative, the more is the revolution possibility, and the working class will ultimately overthrow the capitalist system through a revolution that would lead to the dictatorship of the proletariat and ultimately resulting in a communist society. So this did not happen in Europe. So that was the question why Gramsci basically explained that through his theory of hegemony. After all, Marx had predicted that revolution and the transition to socialism would occur first in the most advanced capitalist societies, but comparatively a backward Russia had made the first breakthrough. So the point is, it did not happen in Europe, rather it happened in a backward and poor country like Russia. So what was the reason? What Marx and Engels predicted about Europe, predicted about the advanced capitalist countries of Europe, that was not materialized, rather it happened in Russia. Gramsci's answer revolved around his use of the concept of hegemony, his understanding of which reflected his broader conceptualization of power. So basically, he tries to explain that through his theory of hegemony. In understanding how the prevailing order was maintained, Marxists had concentrated almost exclusively on the coercive practices and capability of the states that kept the exploited and alienated majority in the society from rising up and overthrowing the system that was the cause of their suffering. So according to the traditional Marxist arguments, the state uses the coercive power because it is captured by the capitalist, it is controlled by the capitalists. So capitalists would never tolerate if there is any problem to their system or their system of production. So they would always use the state's coercive power to silence the majority who were suffering like anything. That was the basic argument of Marxist. That's why he talked about revolution or dictatorship of the proletariat. Gramsci recognized that while this characterization may have some truth in less developed societies such as pre-revolutionary Russia, it was not the case with the more developed countries of the West. Here the system was also maintained through consent. So if you want to understand the concept of power, which is traditionally based on both consent and coercion, so Gramsci is basically focusing on the consent issue, because it was his perception that how the developed countries of the West, they were able to prevent the communist revolution through a consent which he called as manufactured consent. Gramsci shifted the focus of Marxist analysis more towards superstructural phenomena. Unlike the traditional Marxists who talked about the base or the economic factor, so Gramsci basically took the superstructure issue. In particular, Gramsci explored the process by which consent for a particular social and political system was produced and reproduced through the operation of hegemony. So this is how he tried to analyze how the process of consent is manufactured, how the process of consent is produced and reproduced, and that is how the system of capitalist mode of production, the nature of the capitalist country, that is maintained and that is not opposed by the proletariat or the working class despite suffering a lot in that system. Consent on Gramsci's reading is created and recreated by the hegemony of the ruling class in the society. So this consent is not something automatic, it is deliberately manufactured, it is deliberately created, it is deliberately produced. By whom? By the ruling class. In this hegemony that allows the moral, political and cultural values of the dominant group to become widely dispersed throughout the society and to be accepted by subordinate groups and classes as their own. So this is ruling class through colleges, through the education system, through religious institutions, through many other social institutions, they manufacture this consent, and this consent helps the ruling class to get the support of the working class, and sometimes the working class would say that this system in which they are living, they are operating, that is their own system, and if you ask anyone why you are poor, so he will say, I am not poor because of my problem in the system, I am poor because God has made me poor. So this kind of God fearingness, or God is responsible for one's poverty, that kind of thinking is what Gramsci is saying is something manufactured over a long period of time through the education system, through the social institutions, through so many channels including the media. So that is how you consider the system not exploitative. Whatever problems you have, you think this is all God created, or I am responsible for this, nobody else is responsible for this. So this kind of manufactured consent is daily produced, reproduced and abused by the ruling class to perpetuate its unequal and exploitative relationship in the state, in the society. Robert Cox, a Canadian international relations scholar, has attempted to internationalize Gramsci's thought by using several of his concepts, most notably hegemony, to the global context. So if you find Gramscianism or his theory of hegemony, so it was internationalized by none other than Robert Cox. He starts with his famous statement that theory is always for someone and it is always for some purpose. So implying that knowledge cannot be objective and timeless in the sense that some contemporary realist, for example, would like to claim. So according to Cox, who is greatly influenced by Gramsci's theory of hegemony, he thinks that all the theories, whether they are realist theory, they are liberal theory, they are all influenced by maintaining, by justifying, by legitimizing the unequal international system, because all the theories, they have a purpose, they have a vested interest to maintain the same. They are not talking about change, they are only talking of maintaining the status quo. And if you take the example of this white man's burden theory, that theory was also based on the premise that God has made some people white so that they can civilize the blacks, and how this kind of misperception, this kind of theorization led to the evolution and growth of imperialism and colonialism in different parts of the world. So theory has always some vested interest. Those who make those theories, those who use those theories, they always do it for their vested interest. That was the principal argument of Cox. He suggests that we need to look at those theories very closely, and what is their purpose, what is their ideas, and what is their objective, and about whose interest they are talking about. So that should be the task of the theoreticians, or that should be the main purpose or occupation of the international relations scholars. The purpose of realist and neo-realist theories, whether consciously or unconsciously, is to reinforce and serve the interest of those who prosper under the prevailing system. So if you look at the realist theory or maybe neo-realist theory, they were developed under a particular historical circumstances when America wanted to fight a Cold War with USSR, and it needed this kind of theories to justify its competition with USSR, which it considered as a different country with a different ideology. So those theories were not impartial. They are all biased because they particularly justify the activities of USA, the foreign policy of USA. According to Cox, successive dominant powers in the international system have shaped a world order that suits their interest. If you look at the United Nations, even World Bank and IMF, you will find that how these Bretton Woods systems were established for assisting the Western advanced countries, those who were devastated during the Second World War. So the point is, so these are not impartial institutions. These are not institutions that care for whole of the world. Rather, they care for those who establish those institutions. The best example is the United Nations Security Council veto system. Those who were the victorious countries, those who are the allied powers, they establish the United Nations so that they can maintain their hegemony through the veto system in the United Nations Security Council. And they have done so not only as a result of their coercive capabilities, but also because they have managed to generate a broad consent for the order, even among those who are disadvantaged by it. So basically, everybody considers United Nations as the perfect example. It has universal membership. They glorify those institutions and think that, and everybody talks about the liberal international order, but this liberal international order serves whose interest? That is again a $1 million question, because it doesn't serve the interest of India, of any other country who have not attained the kind of economic status as has been the case with America and many other advanced economies of the West. So the point is, those who establish those institutions, they not only maintain their hegemony through those institutions, rather they manufacture a consent in other countries that, this system is the best and there is no need to improve it, there is no need to reform it, because it serves the interest of all countries. So that is the perception according to Robert Cox, and that he analyzes through theory of hegemony. For the two hegemons that Cox analyzes, particularly the United Kingdom and the United States, the ruling hegemonic idea has been free trade. The claim is that this system benefits everybody, which is again questionable, but yet in reality, while free trade is actually serves the interest of the hegemon, and the peripheral countries, those countries who are the countries of the global south, they are not highly benefited by this, because in a competition, those who have the power, those who have the manufacturing capability, those who have capital, those who have technology, they will be highly benefited. But what about those countries who have nothing? So they will only provide the market and engage in a kind of economic relationship, or engage in a kind of unequal relationship that again will perpetuate their inequality, their poverty. The degree to which a state can successfully produce and reproduce its hegemony is an indication of the extent of its power. So according to Cox, those countries, those who can maintain hegemony in the international system and made others to realize that this is a very good kind of system, it depends on the nature of their power. If you are a hegemon, if you are a superpower, you can glorify neoliberal policies that it's the best, globalization is best, neoliberal policies are the best, open market is best, free trade is best. So you can idealize this kind of thinking, and your glorification would be successful if you are a hegemon, if you are the superpower or a great power. So that is his argument. But despite the dominance of the present world order, Cox expects that inevitable economic crisis will act as a catalyst for the emergence of counter-hegemonic movements. So, it's fine that everybody is talking of a liberal international order, but how long this unequal and hegemonic order will continue, that is the question. And Cox particularly thinks that every system contains the seeds of its own destruction, and economic crisis in many countries would definitely force them to raise their voice against the present world order. That will lead to the change in the status quo. Let us now summarize what we have discussed so far. Neo-Marxists consider themselves working within the Marxist intellectual tradition, but broaden the Marxist thought by addressing topics not covered by Karl Marx. They take a less rigid and more modern approach to analyzing the issues of underdeveloped and developed country relations. The world system theory, for instance, highlights the structural factors for understanding the global inequalities and the persistent economic and political domination of the developed nations over the developing countries. Using the concept of hegemony in the broader conceptualization of power, Gramsci explains how cultural and ideological hegemony are used by the dominant class to maintain power over the society. Robert Cox applies Gramsci's theory of hegemony in international relations to argue that a few of dominating countries have established a world order that serves their vested interest, which they achieved with widespread consent, not through coercion, as argued by Gramsci. Cox, however, argues that inevitable economic crisis will act as a catalyst for emergence of counter-hegemonic movements, as we have seen in the example of the BRIC Bank and the major demand for reforming the IMF and World Banks in the post-COVID period. In the next lecture, we will discuss about critical theory and Neo-Marxism. Thank you for your attention. Thank you once again.